Welcome. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Therese Perlowski, and I'll be your moderator today. Today's presentation is part of the Presidential Primary Sources Project, and our program is called Understanding Conflicting Primary Sources When Hoover Met Hitler. And Elizabeth is here to present on behalf of the Hoover Presidential Library and Museum. The Presidential Primary Sources Project is a series that we run every year. It begins in January and it goes all the way through the beginning of April. It's every Tuesday and Thursday. And all of our programs are a collaboration between Internet 2, the National Archives, and the National Park Service. This is just a quick reminder, by participating today, you are going to be recorded, archived, and streamed. So we do record all of these programs and they live on our YouTube channel. So if you want to watch it again or you want to share it with someone who couldn't come live, they all are living on our YouTube channel. All right, for those participating via video, if you're already on video, great. If you want to be on video and you're not, please drop something in the chat and I will promote you. It'll ask you if you want to be promoted to a panelist. If you accept that, we'll be able to see your video. We absolutely want everyone to participate as much as possible today. So if you want to answer a question on video, you can kind of just raise your hand because we can see you. If you want to answer or ask a question with your voice via audio, there's a little raise hand icon in Zoom. It's like a little red hand. If you click on that, we will call on you and help you unmute. And then of course, there's the chat box. We'll use the chat box a lot throughout our presentation today. So if you haven't found it, it looks like a little caption bubble. Go ahead and click on that. You'll be able to ask and answer questions through there. Again, participate as much as possible. That said, make sure you're being respectful of those tools. We want to make sure any questions or thoughts expressed either over audio or in the chat are specifically related to what our presenter is asking. All right, and then just a last thanks. We really appreciate you joining. We hope you check out some of our future programs as well. This is our website. You can find our future programs and information about our recordings there. All right, with that, I'm going to stop sharing and hand it over to Elizabeth.
Hi, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Dinschel, and I am an archivist and education specialist at the Hoover Library. I am going, oh no, it says I cannot share my screen. It says host disabled it. We are located in West Branch, Iowa, so we're right off Interstate 80. So if you guys are cruising across the country, right in the middle of the US, down 80, we're right off 80 in Iowa before Iowa City, I guess, or before Illinois. We're on the eastern side of the state. You can stop in and see us. Let me see if it'll, yay, now I can share. All right. There we go. All right, guys, there we go. All right. So we're going to look at primary sources today. And this is a really interesting topic because sometimes when things happen, we assume that they should be important, and it turns out that they're really not. So what makes a historic event impactful? So we'll talk about that and we'll think about it a lot. We're going to start right now with primary sources. A primary source is a piece of information about a historical event or period in which the creator of the source was an actual participant in or a contemporary of a historical moment. And then examples of primary sources are documents, artifacts, historic sites, songs, or other written tangible items during the historical period you are studying. And so I like to use this truck as a really great example because the picture is a primary source. The actual truck is a primary source. It says in there, there's motion picture. They were playing Master of Emergencies off the back of this truck. So that motion picture is a primary source. Newspaper coverage about the campaign truck was a primary source. And then if somebody told us about the truck, that would be an oral history, and that would be a primary source. And the purpose of these primary sources is to capture the words and the thoughts and the intentions of the past. Primary sources help us to interpret what happened and why it happened. So let's look at secondary sources, because this is the opposite of the primary sources, right? And this is a source that was not created firsthand by someone who participated in the era. An example of a secondary source is one of my favorites. This is the biography Alexander Hamilton by Ron Chernow, but it was published in 2004. And the Broadway sensation Hamilton is based off of this biography, this secondary source. So the interesting thing about looking and starting our research, if you guys are doing a project or if we're a historian, we start our research with a secondary source. They cite all of their primary sources and secondary sources that they used in their bibliographies. So you can use these bibliographies as a roadmap back to the primary sources that they used. And something to keep in mind about using secondary sources is that Ron Chernow looked at these primary sources and he arrived at the conclusions that he did in this biography. I, a different historian, could look at the same exact primary sources and could come to a completely different conclusion. Now, as historians and as researchers and as students, we want to see all of these different perspectives. And it's okay in your papers to say, historians disagree on this point. And then you can add your own analysis to that. And it's good to talk about these points of conflict because over time, we get access to more and more sources of information. So what is historic impact? Imagine that a topic you are evaluating is a stone thrown into the center of the lake. The water ripples that surround your stone demonstrate the consequences or impact of your topic. Whether your topic is a person, an event, an idea, if it has historical significance, it will create change, both short-term and long-term change. And by demonstrating the links between the periods of time, you are understanding the historical perspective of how a person or an event had a historic impact. And this is just an example. And so if we take this example, we're looking at Rosa Parks. She's in the center here. And then we talk about her not giving up her seat on the bus. She's arrested. There's a bus boycott. We see the rise of civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., who helped to organize the Montgomery bus boycotts. The laws change, and the civil rights movement continues to grow from there. And I'm not saying that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is because of Rosa Parks, but that her impact was part of the reason that this happened eventually over time. So we're talking about this meeting with Hoover and Hitler today, and I put Hoover in the center of our impact circle to find out if there's any impact. Sometimes things can be significant without having impact. We'll figure that out. Let's start by looking at this picture. This meeting happens in 1938, and this picture is taken in Hitler's home in Berlin, Germany. Is there anything in this picture that can provide us clues about their meeting? What is in the room? Who is in the room? What are their expressions? How are they sitting? What can you tell from their body language? I'm going to give you guys a minute or two to think about it, and you can raise your hand or you can put your thoughts in the chat box. So I'll give you guys a minute to think about that. All right, so I'm getting some answers. They're sitting on a couch. Their faces look upset and distracted. Is there anything about like where they're sitting here? There's no food or drinks. Yeah, we see these kind of like empty serving dishes on the table, but there's nothing on them. Someone said it seems formal. They didn't get along too well. Yeah, it kind of looks uncomfortable. So I think it's sitting apart, not smiling. Yeah, they're not sitting near each other like in a way you would think that would be comfortable for communication. Are you guys shocked to hear that I changed this picture by cropping it? Now I want to show you guys the real picture. So this is the real picture. And these two men are the ambassador for the United States and a translator that was translating that meeting. But do your feelings about this picture change when you see the entire thing, when you get to see it zoomed out? Can cropping a picture change our perception? Is cropping pictures deceitful? Do you think it was deceitful that I cropped that picture? And if this picture was taken from a different angle, would it give us a different perspective? So like if I was standing on the other side of the room facing like Hoover and Hitler and these two other, the ambassador and translator, would I have a different perspective of that event as it was happening? Yes, someone points out that there is a Nazi symbol in the picture. And the reason I cropped that picture was to crop that symbol out. Partly because we don't like to glorify, symbols of hate, which the swastika has become. And also that in some countries, the swastika is banned. So if the picture finds its way in Germany, for example, they will block it from the internet. And some other sites will block it as well. So the best way to present it is to crop that out of the image or to cover it up. But the image changed. So I want to encourage you guys to take a minute and discuss whether or not your perception of the image changes between seeing the cropped image and the full image. You can add something to the chat box there. Yeah, it says Hitler is quite confident in spite of being surrounded on both sides. Yeah, by all these Americans. And we don't know who else is in the room. And it says it puts Hitler in a more negative light, right? Because you're really getting to see him in this like unaltered state, where we're not hiding anything about him. It's really out there. It says the perception is different because it's a less complete picture. Yeah, actually, let's explore that because that's where we're going to go next. Can the press intentionally mislead people with photography? This is a great photograph series by a photographer that wanted to show people how we can change perceptions by where we're standing and what type of lens we use. So this is a telephoto lens. It's the long lens that kind of hones in on a subject, but it makes this whole area look very busy and very full. If we go to a wide angle lens, then we see that there's all this space and there's these buildings. Suddenly it doesn't look as crowded as it did in the telephoto lens picture, right? And perspective is everything. So this is a time where we're talking about social distancing. If a newspaper takes this picture and prints it and says, nobody is social distancing, how would you know any different? But then if we go to the wide angle lens, we can clearly see that people are social distancing. So two newspapers could run two different versions of these photographs and tell you two completely different things. And what happens when pictures are taken from different perspectives? So we can see in this one, the photographer is like down and even with the people that are in the photograph. Again, it's a telephoto lens. So it looks like, it's really busy in a very full park. But then if we go over to the wide angle lens, the photographer is obviously standing now. He's kind of looking down at everybody. And you see all this negative space and the buildings and all of that kind of stuff again. So how do we get there? I have no idea who's golfing. I just took this picture of people taking pictures of people. Which is awesome. And I put red circles around the different people who are taking photographs. So I want you guys to look at this and tell me what you see. What is the perception and the perspective that these photographers are going to get from the pictures that they snap? What are they doing? You can put that in the chat box or you can raise your hands. Someone's saying they can get close up to pictures or far away. So let's take a look at these pictures, these photographers here. Someone said telephoto lens to get close up picture. Yeah, so when we look at this guy standing over here, he's going to get like the side view of these golfers, right? And then we notice that these photographers are crouched down, and this guy has a telephoto lens, like someone had said, they can get that kind of close-up picture. And I can't see this guy's lens, but let's just assume he's using a wide-angle lens. We know the perspective would be different. And then we have this guy over here on a cell phone. And cell phones are interesting now because in these bigger cameras, the photographs are going to go on something like this, a memory card. And they're going to have to put it in a card reader. And most likely they're going to edit the photograph in Photoshop so that they can make it look better, fix lighting, fix colors, white balance, things like that. But the phones give us the ability to take a picture with no context and then post it immediately into social media. And then it's out there, right? And so we've had a lot of recent examples where reporters have done this and they were wrong about something, but it's hard to take it back once you've already put it out into the world, right? So we see this with sports, we see this with the presidential press poll. Everybody, even though they're looking at the same event, they are standing in a different place, they are using different equipment, they are looking for different things. And so a lot of different perspectives and perceptions can come out of that same time, that same subject, that same reality. So let me ask you guys, how can you trust your eyes? I want to give you guys a minute or two to think about how you can be proactive as citizens and consumers of news to combat seeing things from only one perspective. You can put your comments in the chat or you can raise your hand if you want to speak. So how can you combat seeing things from one perspective? Right, we have some answers coming in. Unless it's an emergency, never send a digital document or image right away. Take a breath, evaluate, do some research, fact check and spell check. Yes, someone else says, think about what is happening in the photo. Someone else says, use different sources of info to get your news. Someone else says, check your surroundings. Yeah. And, you know, the examples of these photographs might change the perspective, but they don't alter the actual subjects or the reality of the people that are in the photographs. So what happens when the press uses Photoshop to change reality and not just perspective? So like if I cut this, you know, person out of the photograph and then glue them into a completely different photograph, do you think that that's illegal? Do you think the press is allowed to do that? Do you think it's okay to mislead people that way? What do you guys think? Not the press? Well, I wanted to go to the most outrageous example that I could find. These are called tabloids. When I was a kid, they lined the grocery store aisles and we saw them every time we were checking out. And this one is from 1957 and it says, modern women aren't human. And there's this like distorted photograph. And this is before Photoshop, way before computers even. And then this three-eyed, three-eyebrowed man says, if you don't believe it, he will tell you why. If you think that was just from 1957, here's 2007 from the Weekly World News that says, the world's only reliable newspaper. And they're talking about boys raised by microbiomes and giant snake terror, 50-foot monster attacks the Western US, hairless werewolf embarrassed to go out at night, hood party where your meal is grilled on your engine. So I remember asking my mom, like, who reads this stuff? Like, this is a joke, right? And my mom even told me then that you'd be surprised at how many people believe this. So it's not illegal. There is certainly a place where the freedom of the press is enshrined, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Yeah, and someone said there's the Soviet removal of people from historic photographs. Yeah, people will use and manipulate primary sources almost to try to change their history, right? So I want to dig into the Hoover-Hitler meeting, but before that, I want to make sure you understand the words we are going to use in the context of 1938. And the reason this is important is because a lot of these words are used today, but they are not defined the same way. So I consulted the Holocaust Memorial Museum, the Smithsonian, for these definitions. They have a whole encyclopedia. And I've put the link in the bottom here. So if you'd like to take a look at it and go to that website, you can do that as well. And so today we're going to be talking about this diplomatic meeting between this former president of the United States and a sitting national leader. Diplomacy is defined as the established method of influencing the decisions and behavior of foreign governments and peoples through dialogue, negotiation, and other methods. Hoover and Hitler will discuss these forms of government that you see up here. So I want to define them so you have them in your mental toolbox, all right? So fascism and Nazism are related, but they have some small differences. So fascism is a far-right political philosophy or theory of government that emerged in the early 20th century. Fascism prioritizes the nation over the individual who exists to serve the nation. While fascist movements could be found in almost every corner of Europe following World War I, fascism was most successful in Italy and Germany. Now let's scoot over and take a look at Nazism. The Nazi Party was a radical far-right movement and political party led by Adolf Hitler. Its formal name was the National Socialist German Workers' Party. And the Nazi Party was not socialist and they were not a workers' party. Remember, we're talking about individuals that lived to serve the nation. Nazi ideology was racist, nationalist, and anti-democratic. It was violently anti-Semitic and anti-Marxist. So that means that they were racist against Jewish people and they despised communism. So communism up here, communism is an economic and political philosophy grounded in the belief that societies are shaped by their economic systems. According to communism, capitalism creates social problems by dividing wealth unfairly between two classes of people. Therefore, the economic system must be reformed to distribute wealth equally. Communist ideas spread rapidly in Europe during the 19th and 20th centuries, offering an alternative to both capitalism and far-right fascism, setting the stage for political conflict with global repercussions. So think about that for a second. Communism is the shared enemy of capitalism, like the United States, and far-right fascism, like Nazi Germany and fascist Italy. And so that's kind of the point here. This is one of the contributing factors leading up to World War II, and then why after that, Russia was kind of pushed off as one of the allies because they became a communist country. So there's another word we're going to look at, and that word is liberalism. And today we use it to talk about to identify people or like it's partisan, but that's not really what it is. The newspapers in Hoover will discuss the values of liberalism. And this is not a partisan political belief. Liberalism is a set of values enshrined in the Constitution and highly prized by the founding fathers. These include life, liberty, property, individual autonomy, and protection of individual rights and equality of opportunity. Hoover believed in rugged individualism, meaning that people were responsible for themselves, and the government's job was to not interfere, but just to preserve individual liberty. So when they're talking about liberal economy and liberal policies and liberalism, they're talking about this set of values that were used to write the Constitution. So one more thing we're going to look at is an embassy. And I'm sure you've heard that word before, but what do embassies do? An embassy is the headquarters for the US government representatives serving in a foreign country. Usually the embassy is in the capital. And if there's smaller embassy offices outside of the capital, they're called consulates. It is normally led by an ambassador who is the US president's representative to the host country. Embassy staff analyze the political and economic situations in the host country and report back to the Department of State on the issues that affect the United States. And I gave you guys a link, diplomacy.state.gov, if you want to learn more about embassies. And as a citizen of the United States, anytime you travel abroad, you should know where your embassy is and how to get a hold of them, because if you're in trouble for any reason when you're abroad, the embassy is your point of contact who is going to help you. That is their job. So make sure you know where your embassy is. And if you travel to Washington, D.C., you can go on Embassy Row and you can see all of the other countries' embassies from around the world. And some of them will even let you go in to visit. It's a really cool street, and I really encourage you guys to see it. So where do we start when we're talking about a topic? We start with context. Context sets the stage for us to have an understanding of how this event may or may not have historic impact, whether or not it has historic significance. And so I will say that this meeting between Hitler and Hoover, in hindsight, is significant because he was the only US president to visit Nazi Germany. The year is 1938. Tensions are high across Europe. Germany is slowly recovering from World War I. Political dissidents are sent to concentration camps. And so again, this is from the United States Holocaust Museum, and it looks at 1933 to 1939. In this time period, concentration camps were not for Jewish people. Dachau was the first concentration camp established. It was opened in 1933 for political prisoners. And then over here, it says the major purpose of the earliest concentration camps was to imprison and intimidate the leaders of political, social, and cultural movements that the Nazis perceived to be a threat to the survival of the regime. So Hoover was not there at a time when there was extermination camps, and he recognized in his after interviews that Jewish citizens were not being treated fairly. And he had noted that he thought it was going to be very bad for Jewish citizens, but didn't really know much beyond that, because while he was there, they controlled his visit. So Hoover is traveling Europe to celebrate the 20 years since the end of the World War. The German government invited him to make a brief stop on his way to Poland. Hoover was reluctant, but he agreed to meet with Hitler and dine with Hermann Goering. The press was very interested in this meeting, as you can imagine. So what amendment of the Constitution protects the freedom of speech? Students out there, you can put your fingers up if you know which amendment gives us freedom of speech, or we can put it in the chat. I see some ones and some twos. First, it's the First Amendment. It is the First Amendment. And so we'll look at this First Amendment. It says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So that's our first right in the First Amendment, freedom of religion, or abridging the freedom of speech. That's our second one. Or of the press, 3, the right to peaceably assemble, 4, and the right to petition the government for redress of grievances, 5. So you have 5 rights in the First Amendment, and one of those is freedom of the press. So now I want to ask you guys a question. Does the US press have the freedom to cover a United States president in other countries? Why or why not? Give you guys a minute to talk about it. And you can put it in the chat box, or you can raise your hand if you want to talk. All right, someone says you have to follow the laws in that country. Any other thoughts there? No, because it might be a secret meeting. That even happens in the United States, right? We find there's diplomatic meetings that happen in secret. Diplomatic immunity, maybe. So I will tell you guys that even when these meetings happen in secret and the press can't cover them, all records created by the president have to be preserved. So they do go to the National Archives and Records Administration, which is where I work. And part of that comes from creating a transparent government. So you can't have access to those documents, but after they are declassified. Someone asked, did Hoover consult with any federal government officials either before or after his visit? Of course, we'll talk about that. And did Hoover's views about Hitler change after his meeting with Hitler? Yes, and we will talk about that as well. So we're going to move chronologically, so in order of time, to see how this unfurls and see what happens. So March 7th, you see that it says Hoover may see Hitler, former president arrived here, he might visit the Reichsführer. So I want to show you guys how we can evaluate our sources. This little tiny article doesn't tell us much, right? But right here in the parentheses, we see the letters AP, and that stands for Associated Press, which is a news wire service. They write articles and then release them to newspapers worldwide to run in their papers. There's also local journalists, but that will have their name and typically what newspaper they come from. So we're going to look for these clues about who wrote these articles while we're moving along. So here's a picture of Hoover and his group of men that are accompanying him to go and see Hitler. They're leaving the hotel here. This is when Hoover and his entourage arrive at the Reichstag, and you can see that the soldiers here are standing at attention and presenting arms because they are acknowledging that Hoover is this distinguished diplomatic guest. Then, of course, we have the picture of the meeting here, which we have seen. So how did the press cover this? Let's take a look. Hoover clashes with Hitler. U.S. would never accept Nazism, he says. Nazism scoured by Herbert Hoover in a talk with Hitler. Hoover attacks Nazi policies in 40-minute interview with Hitler. Okay, so now they're saying they fought, right? Or at least it looks like. So let's take a closer look here at what they say in here. They waged a face-to-face verbal duel. This remarkable clash of minds between the overlord of Germany and the 31st president of the United States was revealed to the International News Service by an authoritative source. So now we have another clue. We know that the International News Service is the one releasing this information, and their source is an authoritative source, but it is not Hoover, it is not Hitler. We don't know who it is. The detractor speaking straight from the shoulder was Herbert Clark Hoover, 31st President of the United States, who spent 40 minutes in private audience with the Fuhrer. Hitler barred Hoover's personal press attaché from attending the meeting, but a reliable source revealed that their conversation developed into one of the most remarkable ideological clashes in recent times. Without mincing words, Hoover bluntly informed Hitler that the United States will never become reconciled to understanding or even having the slightest tolerance for Nazism as a political and national creed. So this sounds like this was a fight, right? Does this sound like that to you guys? Like they were fighting? But then there's also this weird clue that this comes from one person who's a reliable source. He's an anonymous source. So what else do we see here in this article, in these articles? INS, International News Service. Copyright, International News Service. Pierre Huss. Pierre Huss is the correspondent for the International News Service. And this is not the last time we're going to hear about Mr. Huss. So all of these articles that say this came from the International News Service. We know that they are depending on one anonymous source for this story, but as members of the American public in 1938, this is the only information you have. And if you're a researcher and you're looking chronologically like we're doing, then this is where you start. So to start, we think that there was this meeting where Hoover just ripped into Hitler about how terrible Nazism is and how wonderful America is. And that's what we think happened. So let's go on to the next day's news and see what happens here. So we get some clues here. This is from the Associated Press. This article is from March 10th. And it says, in a statement issued after his 2-day visit here, which included a 45-minute talk with Reichsfuhrer Hitler, he veiled his impression of the Nazi regime in generalized observations. That means he didn't accuse him of anything. He just made an observation. He said, talking about Hoover, I am even more reinforced in my belief that the progress of America rests in the principles of intellectual liberty and spiritual freedom. A system of free economy regulated to prevent abuse and popular government. The former president emphasized that while he had talked with many European statesmen and will have many more such discussions, quote unquote, I never discussed the character of such private conversations. So Hoover has just told you guys that he is not going to ever tell you what was in those meetings because he is a gentleman, essentially. So let's see what this article says here. Although Herbert Hoover declined to make any comment on his talk with Adolf Hitler on Tuesday, noting that it would be contrary to the rules of international courtesy for him to say anything about the conversation, it is apparent that some of the things which were said have leaked out through others who were present. And then it goes on to say, this is really interesting. If Hoover made such a statement, he had his nerve with him. Men have been imprisoned in Germany under the National Socialist regime for saying less. That's really shocking. I think it implies, in my interpretation, that people actually think that there was a possibility that Hoover could have been arrested as a sitting president for criticizing the Fuhrer. So let's look at this next article over here. Clash by Hoover and Hitler denied. Both ex-president and German government emphatically spike reports. And this is kind of like 30s lingo. Spike meaning they're disregarding it, that they don't think that it's true. Hoover is being credited in some quarters of the United States with having denounced nationalism during his brief call on the Reichsfuhrer Adolf Hitler yesterday. Emphatic denials were issued from both sides that Mr. Hoover had done any such thing. Nor was there any clash between the two men, spokesman said. So now it's very confusing. Now we're seeing that, well, maybe that didn't happen. And right here in this next article, we feel quite certain Herbert Hoover did not, as some reports have indicated, read Adolf Hitler a stern lecture on the evils of fascism. Hoover is no admirer of fascism, but neither is he one to go around making trouble by insulting the heads of other governments on their home grounds. So now the press is saying in the days following, there was no clash. We don't actually know what happened, and Hoover's not going to talk about it. So imagine you're a researcher writing about this meeting. Now, what are your thoughts? What are you guys thinking now? Who do we believe and why? Where should we look for more information? Go ahead and add some stuff to the comment box. Where should we go look for more information? And what do we think? What are we looking for? So people are asking, are there any other news sources? What other kind of things can we look for too? Did any of his aides discuss the meeting? Did his son Alan talk about it? Which one has the most credibility? Someone said government records. Some press organizations, in some cases, have political bias and an agenda. People are saying primary sources. Which one has more facts versus opinions? Who the source was? So yeah, there's a lot of places we can start to look. And if we start looking here, we start seeing that they're coming from different sources. Chicago Daily News correspondent is one of the places. So yeah, let's go to the source. we have the actual translation of the meeting. And the passage of time allows for primary sources to become available. The Hoover Library opened in 1962. That is around the time these documents became available. And it's 24 years after this event has taken place. So if you do National History Day, they recommend that your topic is about 20 years old for this very reason. The interview between Hoover and Hitler lasted about 40 minutes, they say, but the entire discussion was not that long. Each sentence in question had to be translated. This means the substance of the meeting was considerably less than 40 minutes. And so what I want to look at is there's two areas of this translation where maybe somebody could construe it as tension. So let's look at that. All right, here we go. By way of introduction, President Hoover expressed his admiration for the change which Germany had experienced since his last visit at the time of the armistice, and mentioned in this connection that he had also been in Germany before the war. During his last stay in Germany, all was depressed and despondent, whereas now he had met with very hopeful live atmosphere everywhere in Germany. With great interest, America was following the course of the German experiment, which in many respects diverged from the American views on economic and other matters. America was politically very far distant from Europe and by no means desired to interfere in European political questions. However, in the economic field, there were common American-European interests. America was very strongly interested in the promotion of world trade and in the reduction of hindrances to commerce. So Hoover's actually congratulating Hitler and saying that they're admiring the progress that Germany has made in their economy. So let's go on. Oh, someone asked if it was made by a German official. So I guess I should say that. I guess I forgot to point it out. This is from the American Embassy in Berlin. The translator is actually from the United States Embassy, and there was a German translator as well. And that translation actually recently went to auction and belongs to a private citizen. I asked for a copy of it. I haven't received it yet. One day I'll have it and I'll put it with it. But the translation was approved both by the German interpreter and the interpreter from the US Embassy. So both governments were able to approve the translation that went into the official records. So let's look at more here. President Hoover declared the world must look with admiration at the results achieved in Germany. American problems, however, were different ones. One was so permeated by the liberal economic attitude in America that it would be impossible to build up such a perfect organization as quickly as in Germany. America had to rely on the absolutely voluntary collaboration of every individual and could therefore only proceed considerably slower than Germany. So remember, this is that clash of governments. Hitler's Germany, the citizens served the nation. In Hoover's America, the citizen serves themselves, and they choose whether or not they want to participate in whatever the government is doing. And that is part of the individual liberties that Hoover talked a lot about. One would naturally gladly arrive at similar results in America as in Germany, but was conscious of the slower methods which one must employ herein. For an underpopulated country with tremendous mineral wealth, which had practically not suffered at all from the World War. So he talks a little bit about how, there's this liberal economic thought that would prevent Americans from wanting to do what they were doing in Nazi Germany. So after the Fuhrer once more had given a detailed comparison between the conditions before the assumption of power and afterwards with individual examples, President Hoover replied that in America, one must have such regard for spiritual and intellectual freedom, and that any restrictive measures such had been adopted in Germany would not be possible there. So he's just highlighting, like, remember someone said he made general observations? That's what he's doing. He's saying, this is what Germany does. That wouldn't work in America, but good for you guys. And, you know, I think that was a very diplomatic approach to how he was communicating with him. The Fuhrer replied to this that, in his opinion, the situation in Europe had been as follows. In the measure in which the communistic danger of disintegration increased in the European states, these states saw themselves confronted ever more urgently with the choice of either bringing about a national rebirth with the aid of certain restrictions or of succumbing to communism, which in its turn would then have instituted far greater and more absolute restrictions of all freedom. And America, with its riches, could afford a certain luxury in this respect as well. And so here's this other like connection where Hitler is saying, like, well, Germany had this option. They were crushed by World War I. They could either become like this very nationalist country where everybody was going to serve the nation, or they could become communistic and lose all of the freedoms that they had left. And Hoover and Hitler, in this respect, have common ground because they both see communism as a threat to their respective governments. And I think, like, when you read the whole thing, you can kind of tell that's something they've bonded over a little bit. And so again, he starts talking about Red Spain and radio propaganda and training courses for civil war in Moscow for foreign communists, and really kind of talking about how much of a danger communism was to Germany when he came to power. And also in the meeting, he talks a lot about how he's not a dictator, how he used legal means to become the Fuhrer, and that he was elected. He was not a dictator. And Hoover will tell you in his afterthoughts about this meeting that that was something that greatly offended Hitler, but he was most definitely a dictator. And so again, he talks about in Germany that communist emissaries are arrested, they're sent to concentration camps, and just goes on to explain that. In conclusion, President Hoover replied with a word of thanks to the Fuhrer and renewed stressing of his interest in the development of the new Germany. So we get some clues from the only parts that really show tension, because the rest of it, they're talking about roads and housing. It's not really anything that you think someone could interpret as a clash, but these were the spots where that was. And Therese will email everybody the transcripts so that you guys can read them, and the interview that he gave with Stanford that was an off-the-record conversation about his observations of Nazi Germany and his conversation with Hitler, which has a very different tone than this actual interview. So, yeah, many Americans said in Italy, Mussolini made the trains run on time. That was definitely a saying that you'll hear over and over when you study World War II for sure. So now we're going to look at some of these other primary sources, and they're going to give us some clues about what was going on between the governments after this meeting and after this press information had come out. So let's take a look at what this telegraph tells us. It says, telegram received from Berlin, March 10th at 2:20. The Secretary of State in Washington, just like we talked about that chain of command in the embassy. And this is a rush, so they wanted to get it to him ASAP. And it is dispatch number 102. And so let's take a look at this topic here. A full report of Mr. Hoover's visit is being sent by mail, including details of his conversation with the Chancellor. Contrary to certain press reports here, there was nothing in the nature of an argument between Mr. Hoover and the Chancellor during an interview. The Chancellor set forth his views of German economic difficulties and his plans and procedures for remedying them. Mr. Hoover asked various questions concerning conditions here, and in phrasing the questions, occasionally drew attention to the difference of American conceptions and methods, to which the Chancellor listened with interest, commenting from time to time that the totally different conditions in Germany required other procedures than those which would be effective in the United States. And this is from Ambassador Wilson, the same person we saw on that transcript, because that transcript does come out of his office. And it comes with this. This is dispatch number 22. It's circled up here on the left. Embassy of the United States, Berlin, March 14th. Subject, visit of former President Herbert C. Hoover to Berlin. And then we see it's confidential. And all of these stamps on here tell us all of the offices who received this transmission, when they received it, probably who read it. There's a lot to unpack from looking at these stamps. And then we see again, this is going to the Secretary of State in Washington. So let's go over and look at this document real quick. So Mr. Hartigan made the arrangements. He was the delegate for the New York World's Fair, and he invited Hoover to to have the meeting with Hitler. And Hoover requested Mr. Paul Smith from the San Francisco Chronicle to replace Mr. Hartigan to meet with the chancellor. The request was not complied with. While the excuse was made it was too late to change the arrangements and that the chancellor did not like to have too many people present at the conversations, representatives of the Foreign Office very frankly mentioned the fact that they understood that the San Francisco Chronicle, with which Mr. Smith is connected, had been bitterly critical of the present regime in Germany. So this is where we know that even though you have a U.S. representative of the press traveling with the United States president, and the president asked if Mr. Smith could accompany him into the meeting, the chancellor had reserved the right to tell him no. And he told him no because he didn't like what the San Francisco Chronicle had published about him before. So there's more. There's more in the longer dispatch. And it says, here, International News Service. I wanted to point that out again. But he mentions these incidents about Smith not being included as having some bearing on the story sent out by the representative of the International News Service, and it is understood by the New York Times Bureau here, wherein it was represented that a clash occurred between Mr. Hoover and the Chancellor over the issue of democracy versus totalitarianism. As stated in my Telegram 102 of March 10, the one we just looked at, there was nothing in the nature of a clash in the interview. In no way expressed any criticism of the German government, talking about Herbert Hoover. And so this is where it's really interesting for us. Mr. Smith, in talking over the matter with Mr. Huss, remember I pointed out Huss to you, he's the representative of the International News Service, apparently represented the interview between Mr. Hoover and the Chancellor as having been something in the nature of a warm debate as to the merits of liberal and authoritarian regimes, and according to the correspondent, approved a story to the effect which was wired to the United States without the correspondent having talked with me. The story aroused considerable resentment in the government here, although no mention of it was made in the German-controlled press, and as reported in my telegram, for a time the German government considered expelling Mr. Huss from Germany. Mr. Huss is a German citizen, and they were going to throw him out of the country for misrepresenting this meeting. So that gives you a really good glimpse into what it's like to operate under a fascist government. And it gets worse. The service story, they say it is the fault of Mr. Smith. So now they've pinpointed who sent this bad story to the International News Service. The German government was quite aware of Mr. Smith's connection with the story, since it had transcripts of his telephone conversations on the subject with the correspondent of the International News Service. And notice somebody here put some marks on the side of it to show that this was important, and this was not made by us. And why is this important? How did the German government have transcripts of a private telephone conversation between Paul Smith and Huss? That means they were wiretapping the phones that people were using while they were in Germany. So the German government already knew how the story was going to come out, and that may be the reason that they hid it from the German public. Somebody says, why do you keep calling him ex-president? Hoover was not the president in 1938. He was the former president. He was the ex-president. So in our last telegraph that we see, our last communication that we see, it's from the Department of State. We see this is in April. The conversation was in March. This is a full month later. And it's a summary. And just the summary goes through and absolutely reiterates all of the facts that came from dispatch number 22 and 102 originally, and still blames this report of a clash on Smith and the International News Service and Huss. So what this comes down to, especially like what we're looking at now, is this fake news? And I would say yes. Part of the problem with fake news is that it can be based in fact, but parts of it are manipulated and misleading. So you can say, oh, well, Hoover met with Hitler, so it is plausible that this event happened. But that doesn't mean that it did. So sometimes fake news is just really, really subtle. So use multiple news sources to see different perspectives. Be skeptical of everything you see. When researching, use multiple sources, primary and secondary, and use different mediums like we were talking about, newspapers, documents, videos, oral histories, all of the different things that you have available to you to make sure that you're getting the most perspectives. Be a responsible consumer of media, be a good researcher, and stay informed. And you guys hit the nail on the head when you said you should look for other sources to get your news and not just rely on one place. I'm happy to take any questions. Someone said, did Hoover ever consider that his meeting would increase Hitler's respectability around the world? I think that's always a concern. And I think this is one of the topics that's really interesting because you can like peel it back like an onion. And one of the things you can talk about is how presidents and former presidents have to interact with people that we consider enemies to our democracy. So like a communist ruler or like a fascist dictator, should we communicate with them? Do we have to communicate with them? It's a way to keep peace. If we look at places like Camp David, that's where they go and do these diplomatic negotiations with people who are like Hitler, but you're trying to influence them with your, these values that America has to try to keep peace, to try to negotiate commerce and things like that. So not that it was respectable, but that it's kind of a part of the job. Did Hoover ever indicate regret for his meeting with Hitler? No. And so I'm sending that. Teresa's going to email you guys those documents. And there's that document where he gives this kind of like post-mortem about the visit with the Stanford teachers or professors. And he talks about like, he was very aware that things were being hidden from him. So he went to the outskirts of Germany and visited universities and asked them about what was really going on. And they talked about how they took away academic freedom and freedom of speech. And if you disagreed, they were putting people in concentration camps. They were pulling kids out of school. If any kids were really smart, like genius kids or gifted kids, they would take them out and put them in special schools that indoctrinated them and advanced their studies so that they could serve the nation. Kind of in that idea of like what the political philosophy of fascism is. So I don't know if he regretted it, but looking at that explanation of how he felt about it is really a different perspective than we're used to, because we're seeing Nazi Germany and a fascist government through the eyes of a former United States president, and one who was really principled about preserving individual rights and liberty. So he was very skeptical of everything that was going on around him and really did want to warn people about it, but in his own very diplomatic and respectable way. Like he said, I don't talk about these things. So that conversation you guys get is off the record, but now we can show it to people. Someone said, did Hoover talk to Charles Lindbergh about their meetings with Hitler? I don't know an answer to that question, honestly. But Hoover and Lindbergh were certainly friends, and they worked on a lot of air travel and commerce legislation that came out and regulations, some of which are still on the books today. They did have a really interesting relationship, and I would not be surprised if Hoover had talked to him about it. But the problem for us is we exist before the Presidential Records Act. So we didn't get all of Hoover's records. We only got what he donated to our library. So if there was any indication that he had talked to Lindbergh about it, we don't have it. Are there any more questions? Well, I'm so glad you guys joined me. Email me if you have any questions, certainly. Therese will email you those documents so you guys can look at them more. If you're curious, I encourage you to read them. They're really, really fascinating, and it will give you some more perspective about what that meeting was like and how it happened.
Absolutely. Well, thank you everybody who joined. We so appreciate your attendance.
Yes.
And thank you, Elizabeth, for taking your time and sharing so much great information.
Thank you. Thank you guys. Have a good day.